The cold wind howled through the valley as snowflakes danced like lost souls. Deep in the Montana wilderness, a mountain man named Elias trudged through the thick snow, his old rifle slung over his shoulder, his breath turning to fog in the freezing air. He lived alone in a small wooden cabin at the edge of the forest, far from towns and people, far from noise and deceit. The world had hardened him, years of solitude had turned him into a man who spoke little and trusted less. That evening, as the sun bled orange over the peaks, he saw smoke rising in the distance, a strange sight in those parts. Curious, Elias followed the faint trail, stepping over frozen roots until he reached a makeshift camp hidden between rocks. There, huddled under a torn blanket, sat a woman holding something wrapped in cloth. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, her eyes hollow yet filled with something more painful than fear, grief. "Ma'am," Elias spoke cautiously, his voice rough like gravel. "You lost." The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes glistened in the fading light. "No," she whispered. "I came here, to bury my child." Elias froze. He looked closer. In her arms, beneath the thin cloth, lay a small lifeless body, a boy, no more than 6. The sight pierced through the man's heart like a knife. "I begged for help," she said softly. "In the town, no one would come. They said the ground's frozen, that no one has time for a poor widow's sorrow." Her words cracked. "Please, sir, can you help me bury my child?" Elias felt something stir in him, a long-forgotten ache. He remembered his own boy, Samuel, who'd died 10 winters ago when fever took him before the snow melted. He remembered digging through frozen ground with his bare hands because no one else would help. The memory was a scar he'd buried deep, but now it burned again. He swallowed hard. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said. "Come with me. My cabin's not far." She hesitated, clutching her child tighter. "Please," she said again. "Just help me bury him. He deserves rest." Elias nodded slowly. "All right." He set down his rifle, pulled out his shovel, and began to dig into the frozen earth. The ground resisted him, the iron edge striking stone, but he kept going. Each strike echoed through the valley, sharp and cold. The woman knelt nearby, whispering prayers through tears, her hands trembling as she clutched the little bundle. Hours passed before the ground yielded a shallow grave beneath the pines. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow, though the air was freezing. The woman placed her child gently into the earth. She whispered, "He loved the mountains. Said the wind here sounded like angels." Elias said nothing, his jaw clenched as he pushed the soil back over the small body. When the last handful of snow-covered dirt fell, the woman broke down. She fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, the sound echoing through the silence of the forest. Elias knelt beside her, awkward at first, unsure of how to comfort. Then, without thinking, he put his hand on her shoulder. "He's resting now," he said quietly. "The mountains'll watch over him." She nodded weakly. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're the only one who helped me." He built a small wooden cross from broken branches and placed it over the grave. Then, seeing the woman shivering violently, he said, "Come. You'll freeze to death out here." At the cabin, he stoked the fire until it roared, warming the small room. She sat near it, hands stretched out to the flames, her eyes fixed on nothing. Her clothes were torn, her face gaunt, she hadn't eaten in days. Elias boiled soup and placed it in front of her. She hesitated before eating, murmuring, "I didn't mean to burden you." "You didn't," he said. "You needed help. That's reason enough." As she ate slowly, he studied her in the firelight. Her name was Clara, she said between spoonfuls. Her husband had died the previous year in a logging accident. Since then, she'd been moving from town to town, trying to find work. The boy, Daniel, had fallen ill on the road. By the time she reached the valley, it was too late. Elias listened in silence, his eyes heavy with memory. He poured her a cup of tea and said quietly, "Sometimes the world takes too much from good people." She nodded, tears glistening again. "I thought God forgot me." He stared into the fire. "Maybe he didn't," he murmured. "Maybe he sent you here." Days turned into weeks. Elias let Clara stay until the snow eased. She helped with the chores, chopping wood, mending clothes, feeding the fire when the nights grew cruel. The cabin that once echoed with silence now held the soft sound of footsteps, the faint hum of a woman's voice. Elias noticed something shift inside him. The loneliness that had haunted him for years began to fade. The grief he carried started to breathe again, not as a wound but as a quiet strength. One morning, Clara stood outside, looking toward the grave up on the hill. "He's at peace," she said softly. "I can feel it." Elias joined her. "You'll stay a while longer," he said. "Winter's not done yet." She smiled faintly. "You've done enough already." He shook his head. "Maybe I haven't done near enough." Spring came, melting the last of the snow. Wildflowers began to bloom near the child's grave. Elias carved a proper cross this time, strong oak wood, polished and smooth. He etched Daniel's name on it himself. When Clara saw it, she broke into tears again, not of sorrow, but gratitude. She turned to Elias. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "You didn't even know us." He looked at her for a long moment. "Because once," he said, his voice low, "I needed help too. And no one came." That night, as the stars burned bright above the mountain ridge, Clara sang softly by the fire, a lullaby she once sang to her son. Elias sat listening, his eyes reflecting the glow of the flames. The sound filled the cabin like a gentle wind through pine. For the first time in years, he felt peace, not the kind found in solitude, but in shared sorrow that turned into quiet strength. Weeks later, when Clara finally left for the valley below, Elias walked her down the mountain trail. They stood in silence for a while. She reached out and pressed his calloused hand. "You gave my son a resting place," she said. "And you gave me reason to live again." He nodded, his throat tight. "You gave me the same." She turned and walked down the trail until the mist swallowed her figure. Elias watched until she disappeared. Then he looked back toward the grave on the hill, where sunlight now spilled through the pines, and whispered, "Rest easy, little one." And from that day, every evening when the wind swept through the mountains, Elias would hear a faint, sweet sound between the trees, like a child's laughter carried on the breeze, reminding him that sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can awaken the part of us we thought was long dead. Elias stood for a long time at the edge of the trail, watching the place where Clara had vanished, the mist swallowing her like the mountain itself was taking her in. A part of him wanted to call out, to tell her to stay, but the words never left his mouth. His life had been one of silence for so long that speaking out of the rhythm of his own breath felt foreign. The forest creaked and whispered in the wind. The snow was melting into the earth, leaving behind wet soil and a smell of pine that filled his lungs. He walked back up the slope slowly, step by step, his boots sinking into patches of slush. As he neared the grave, sunlight broke through the clouds in soft ribbons, touching the wooden cross like gentle fingers. The name carved into the oak, Daniel, stood bold against the pale sky. Wildflowers were just beginning to push their way up from the ground. It amazed him how the earth never stopped giving life, even where sorrow had settled its roots. He knelt down, brushing snow from the base of the cross. "Boy," he whispered, his voice low, "she'll be all right." The breeze responded, soft as a breath against his cheek. He stayed there for a while, staring at the cross, not with pain but with a kind of stillness he hadn't known in years. The last time he'd spoken at a grave was when he buried his own boy. Back then, he had screamed at the sky until his voice gave out, demanded answers from a silent God. This time, there was no screaming. Just quiet. Over the next days, the cabin returned to its old silence, but it wasn't the same silence as before. When Clara had first arrived, the quiet had been interrupted by her soft footsteps, the sound of soup boiling, the hum of a woman trying to keep herself from falling apart. When she left, the silence that remained carried the echo of those sounds. They didn't leave him. They lived in the walls now. Elias spent the early mornings chopping wood. The snow was gone, but the mountain nights were still bitter cold. Every strike of his axe felt heavier than usual, not because he was tired but because something inside him had shifted. It wasn't grief that weighed him down. It was something else, something quieter, like an ember refusing to die out. At night, he sat by the fire and looked at the chair where Clara used to sit. It felt strange how a person could become part of a place so quickly. Her voice lingered in the cabin's corners like smoke after a long burn. For years, Elias had thought solitude was all he deserved. That after losing Samuel, after watching the world turn its back on his pain, there was no place for warmth in his life. But Clara had walked into his silence with nothing but grief in her arms and left behind a spark that refused to go out. Weeks turned into months. Spring painted the mountains in green. Rivers swelled with melted snow, animals stirred in the forest, and Daniel's grave became surrounded by a patch of wildflowers brighter than anything else in the valley. Elias tended to the spot every few days without really thinking why. He pulled out weeds, cleared fallen branches, and sometimes just stood there listening to the wind. He had never been the praying kind after Samuel's death, but here, at the grave of a boy he barely knew, silence felt holy. One afternoon, as he worked on fixing the roof, a voice called out from down the trail. He froze. Visitors were rare up here. He climbed down slowly, rifle slung loosely over his shoulder. "Mr. Elias," the voice called again, higher this time. A young man on horseback emerged from the bend. He wore a dusty coat and carried a satchel. His face was sunburned and his eyes held the kind of exhaustion only long travel gives. "You Elias Thorne?" the stranger asked. Elias nodded cautiously. "Who's asking?" The man pulled out an envelope, edges worn and stained from the road. "Got a letter for you. From a woman named Clara Hart." Elias felt something tighten in his chest. "Clara," he said quietly. The man nodded. "She was down in the valley. Gave me some coin to make sure this reached you. Said it was important." Elias took the letter with rough, calloused hands. He didn't remember the last time someone had written to him. After paying the man for his trouble, he went back inside, set the letter on the table, and stared at it for several minutes before daring to open it. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper. The letter was written in neat handwriting, a bit shaky but full of life. "It's been months since I left your mountain. I don't know if I deserve to write to you, but I wanted to thank you again, for burying Daniel, for giving me a place to rest when I had nothing left. I've found work in the valley as a seamstress. The people here are kinder than the last town, and I'm slowly finding my feet. I visit the church sometimes, but I think the place I found the most peace was up there on your mountain. Daniel's grave, it's the only place that felt like home after he passed. I hope the wildflowers have started to bloom by now. I imagine him smiling there. I don't know why I'm writing this, maybe because you were the first person in a long time who saw me when I was invisible. If you ever need anything, or if the mountain gets too quiet, come find me in Clearwater Valley. You'll find my name at the tailor's shop." He stared at the words for a long time. The cabin seemed warmer just reading them. Her voice came back to him, soft and broken, yet strong. The idea of going down to the valley felt foreign. He had avoided towns for years. But now, the thought of never seeing Clara again felt heavier than the isolation he had built around himself. The following morning, Elias took the trail that led down the mountain, a trail he had walked maybe twice in 10 years. The valley opened wide before him, filled with green fields and distant houses clustered like small stones near the river. People bustled about in the town square, voices rising in a mix of laughter and work. He felt out of place, like a bear wandering into a church. His boots were caked with dirt, his beard wild, his coat patched from years of wear. But he followed the directions on the letter until he found a modest shop near the corner of the square. A sign above the door read Clara's Tailoring and Stitch. He stood outside for a long moment, heart pounding in a way he didn't expect. Then he pushed the door open. Inside, sunlight poured through the windows, lighting up rolls of fabric stacked neatly on shelves. Clara stood behind the counter, needle in hand, mending a torn jacket. Her hair was tied back, a streak of sunlight touching her cheek. When she looked up and saw him, her hand froze mid-stitch. "Elias," she breathed. He nodded, suddenly unsure of what to say. "Got your letter." A smile slowly bloomed across her face, not a forced smile, not the kind she had worn to survive, but a real one. She came around the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. "You came all the way down the mountain. Figured I'd see how you're doing," he said gruffly, trying to hide the warmth in his voice. She laughed softly. "I'm better. Not whole, not yet, but better." They sat at a small table near the window, drinking weak tea she had brewed. She told him about her new life. How the townsfolk had taken her in, how she worked late into the night sewing for the farmers, how sometimes she still woke up reaching for Daniel. Elias listened quietly. He didn't offer false comfort. He simply listened, and she seemed to understand that his silence was a kind of care. As the day stretched on, he helped her fix a broken shelf in the back. It felt strange to use his hands for something other than surviving. He found himself smiling more than he had in years, though he didn't quite realize it. When the sun began to set, she walked him to the edge of town. "You don't have to go back up tonight," she said softly. "I've got a spare room." He shook his head slowly. "I've got to tend the cabin. The mountain won't wait." She nodded, but he could see the faint disappointment in her eyes. It mirrored the strange ache inside him. Then promise me you'll visit again, she said. He met her gaze. I promise. Elias walked back up under a moonlit sky, the valley glowing behind him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't dread returning to an empty cabin. The silence that met him at the door felt different now, not heavy, but waiting. He placed her letter on the mantel above the fire like it was something sacred. Summer came with thunderstorms that rolled across the mountains like drums. The forest grew thick and alive. Elias spent his days hunting, mending, and tending to Daniel's grave, where the wildflowers now covered the mound like a bright blanket. And every few weeks, he would make the long journey down to the valley. Each time he visited, Clara's shop had grown busier. She laughed more, smiled more easily. She was no longer the woman who had stumbled into the forest with nothing but grief in her arms. But there were moments, quiet ones, when they sat on the porch together after the town had gone to sleep, that the pain still flickered in her eyes. He understood it because it flickered in his, too. One evening in late summer, a storm rolled in fast. Elias had been helping Clara fix a roof leak above her shop. Rain came down hard, wind howling through the streets. Thunder cracked over the valley like a whip. She grabbed his arm to steady herself against the gust, and for a brief moment, something passed between them, not just gratitude, not just comfort, but something deeper. When the rain softened, they sat inside, dripping wet, laughing at their soaked clothes. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and poured them each a cup of warm cider. You know, she said, voice quiet beneath the patter of rain, Daniel used to ask me why people stop being kind when they have nothing left to gain. I didn't have an answer back then. But the night you helped me, I think I found one. Elias looked at her, his rough hands wrapped around the warm mug. What's the answer? Some people don't help because they want something, she said softly. Some people help because they've known pain too. And they don't want anyone else to face it alone. His throat tightened. He didn't respond, but she didn't need him to. That night, he stayed in the spare room upstairs, listening to the rain soften to a whisper. He thought about Samuel, about the years he'd spent building walls to keep the world out. And he thought about how a grieving woman in her child's grave had found a way to climb over those walls without asking permission. By autumn, Clara's shop had become the heart of the town. People came not just for her stitching, but for the warmth she carried. Elias visited more often than he admitted to himself. Sometimes he brought her meat or pelts from the mountain. Sometimes he brought nothing at all. And she never asked for more than his company. The grave up on the hill became their shared place. They climbed the mountain together one crisp October morning, the leaves burning red and gold around them. Clara knelt by the grave, tracing Daniel's name with her fingertips. I thought I'd never smile again, she whispered. But I think he'd want me to. Elias stood behind her, hands shoved in his coat pockets. He'd like the view, he said quietly. She looked up at him, eyes bright despite the wind. Thank you. For everything. You don't owe me anything, he replied. She shook her head. That's not what I mean. You gave me back more than kindness. You gave me back myself. Something shifted in Elias then. All those years of silence, of shutting the world out, had convinced him he was done with life beyond survival. But standing there with her, he realized that even the hardest winters can end. As the years passed, their bond deepened, not because of grand gestures but through shared quiet. Winters came and went. They celebrated Daniel's birthday at his grave with wildflowers every spring. They built new shelves in the shop together, fixed roofs, shared soup by the fire. Slowly, gently, without either of them naming it, a new kind of family formed between two broken souls who had once been strangers on a frozen night. The mountain, once a place of exile for Elias, became a home again, not just for him, but for the memory of a boy who loved the sound of wind like angels, and for the woman who taught a lonely man that sorrow can bloom into something beautiful if it's shared. Elias never forgot the night he first heard Clara's voice pleading in the cold, "Please bury my child." He had thought it was a request born of tragedy. But in truth, it was the beginning of a story that neither of them saw coming, a story written in silence, snow, and the stubborn will of two hearts that refused to give up. Years later, as the wind moved softly through the pines above Daniel's grave, Elias would still visit that spot every morning. And every time he heard the breeze sing through the trees, he thought of that night, snow, and the stubborn will of two hearts that refused to give up. Years later, as the wind moved softly through the pines above Daniel's grave, Elias would still visit that spot every morning. And every time he heard the breeze sing through the trees, he thought of that night, not with pain, but with a quiet, unshakable grace. The mountain no longer felt empty. It whispered with the laughter of a boy, the warmth of a woman's smile, and the steady beat of a man's heart learning how to live again. The years slipped through the cracks of time like water through cupped hands. The mountain changed with the seasons, but Elias remained, his cabin still standing against the wind like an old sentinel of the wilderness. Clara's visits became more frequent now. What had started as a thread of friendship slowly grew into something neither dared to name aloud. Every few weeks, she would arrive on horseback with a basket tied behind her saddle, fresh bread, dried apples, bits of cloth, and letters she thought he might never read. She would smile as she climbed the porch steps, and he, though rough and quiet, would feel the same flutter in his chest every time. "Still alive, I see," she'd tease, setting her basket down. "Barely," he'd answer, and for both of them, the silence that followed was more comforting than words. They had fallen into an unspoken rhythm, two broken souls who didn't need to fill the air with noise to understand each other. Clara mended his clothes, and Elias repaired her tools or cut firewood for her shop. When winter settled, she sometimes stayed for days, afraid of being caught in the snow. The cabin that once echoed with emptiness now held laughter, soft, hesitant at first, then full and warm, like sunlight finding its way into an old house. One winter evening, as the wind screamed outside and the snow piled high against the door, Clara sat by the fire mending a tear in his coat. Elias sat across from her, carving a small piece of wood into the shape of a bird. His hands, rough and scarred, moved slowly but with care. "You always working," she said without looking up. He chuckled quietly. "So are you." She smiled faintly. "If I stop, I think too much." He looked up from his carving. "About Daniel," she nodded. "Sometimes I still wake up hearing his voice. I dream that he's calling for me, and when I open my eyes, there's just the wind." Elias set the carving aside. "It doesn't go away," he said softly. "Losing someone, you just learn to live around the hole they leave." Her hands paused. The fire crackled, the flames dancing like they were listening. "And you?" she asked. "Do you still see him? Your boy?" Elias stared into the fire for a long while before answering. "Every day," he said. "When the snow falls, when I hear the river in spring. He's in everything." Clara looked at him, her eyes full of something that wasn't pity but understanding. The kind that can only come from shared pain. The wind outside softened into a slow, mournful hum. Elias stood and placed another log on the fire. Then he handed her the carving, the wooden bird, its wings spread as if ready to take flight. "It's not much," he said, voice rough, "but maybe it'll remind you that he's still free. Still flying." Clara held the little bird in her palm, her fingers trembling. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "You made this." He shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "Helps keep my hands busy." She reached across the space between them and touched his wrist. "Thank you, Elias." Something in her touch, gentle, steady, familiar, broke through the final layer of ice around his heart. The years of silence, of loneliness and self-punishment, began to melt. They sat there for hours, saying little, just two people sharing the same warmth. The storm raged for 2 days, sealing them inside. They cooked what little they had, laughed over burnt bread, and told stories neither had shared with another soul. Clara spoke of her childhood by the river, of the nights she'd sing Daniel to sleep with lullabies her mother taught her. Elias told her of the days before his isolation, when he and his son would go fishing in the valley. His voice cracked when he said the boy's name, but Clara's hand found his, and the silence between them turned tender. On the third morning, when the sun broke through the clouds, Elias went outside to clear the snow from the roof. Clara watched him from the doorway, his figure strong against the brightness. For a moment, she realized how much this man had come to mean to her. He had been a stranger, then a savior, then a friend, and now, something far deeper, though she couldn't bring herself to name it. When he came back inside, cheeks flushed from the cold, she said quietly, "When spring comes, I want to see Daniel's grave again." Elias nodded. "We'll go together." And they did. When the thaw came, the mountain woke with color. Birds returned, the river sang again, and the earth softened beneath their boots. The wildflowers around Daniel's grave were already blooming when they arrived. Clara knelt in front of the cross, brushing her fingers over the carved name. "I dreamed of this place," she said softly. "But in my dream, he wasn't lying here. He was running through the trees, laughing." Elias smiled faintly. "Maybe he was." They stayed there most of the day. She sang softly, a lullaby that drifted into the trees, and Elias sat nearby, carving another small cross to replace the one the snow had weathered. It felt less like sorrow now, more like peace, a fragile kind of peace born from acceptance. After that visit, Clara began coming to the mountain more often. Sometimes she stayed weeks at a time. She started a small garden near the cabin, planting herbs and wild vegetables. Elias helped her build a fence around it, though he grumbled the whole time, claiming he didn't know a thing about gardening. She only laughed and told him to dig where she pointed. The garden thrived, and so did their lives together. They cooked, worked, argued about little things, and sat by the fire as the sun sank behind the peaks. The silence that used to haunt Elias now felt like a friend. One evening, as the sky blazed pink and gold, Clara sat on the porch with a mug of tea, her hair catching the light. Elias joined her, his hands rough, his face lined but softer now. "You ever think about leaving the mountain?" she asked. He looked out toward the valley, where the river shimmered. "Used to," he said. "Thought I'd die up here alone. But now, I don't think I could leave." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "And if someone asked you to?" He met her eyes. "Depends who's asking." The air between them held still, thick with something that had been growing for years. Clara's gaze softened, and she whispered, "You've given me a reason to breathe again, Elias. I don't think you realize what that means." He swallowed hard. "You gave me the same." That night, as the stars came out one by one, they sat close enough for their shoulders to touch. Neither said another word. The silence between them was enough, it carried everything that needed saying. Summer came bright and alive. Travelers occasionally passed through the valley, sometimes stopping at Clara's shop, sometimes venturing near Elias's land to hunt or fish. But most kept their distance. Everyone in town knew the mountain man preferred his peace. One morning, Clara received a letter from a wealthy merchant offering her a position in the city, better pay, a large house, and a future she could build beyond the valley. When she read it, her hands trembled. It was everything she'd once dreamed of having before the world fell apart. But when she looked toward the mountains, her heart twisted. That evening, she told Elias. "You should go," he said after a long pause. "You deserve it." She shook her head. "It's not what I want. You could build a new life." She smiled sadly. "I already have." He didn't know what to say. The truth was, the thought of her leaving felt like losing her all over again. But he didn't tell her that. Instead, he stared into the fire, his jaw tight. "Elias," she said gently, "I'm not going anywhere." He looked up, and for the first time in years, his eyes softened with tears he didn't bother to hide. As the years passed, they grew old together on that mountain. The cabin expanded, an extra room here, a porch there. The little garden became a field of color every summer, filled with bees and butterflies. Daniel's grave remained untouched, always blooming with wildflowers. Every morning, Elias would rise before the sun, make coffee, and sit on the porch listening to the wind. Clara would join him with her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, and they would watch the world wake. One cold autumn morning, she didn't come out. He found her still in bed, her face peaceful, her hand resting on the wooden bird he had carved years ago. He knew before touching her that she was gone. Elias sat beside her, his rough hands trembling. He didn't cry, not at first. He just sat there, the room filled with the faint scent of pine and dried herbs, her sewing basket still open near the chair. When the tears came, they came like rain after drought, silent, heavy, endless. He buried her beside Daniel, under the same tree where the wind always whispered. He carved her name into a cross, hands shaking with age and grief. For days after, the cabin felt impossibly still. The fire burned lower each night, and his voice echoed in rooms that had once been filled with hers. He spoke to her sometimes, out loud, as though she might still be listening. He told her about the deer tracks he saw near the stream, about the first snow that dusted the valley, about the dream he'd had where she was laughing, holding Daniel's hand. Winter returned, as it always did. Elias grew weaker with each passing month. The mountain, once his fortress, now felt like a gate between worlds. But he didn't fear it. He had lived enough to know that death was not an ending, just another kind of silence. One morning, as the sun rose pale and cold over the peaks, Elias took his rifle and climbed the trail to the graves. His breath came slow, his legs heavy. When he reached the spot, he sat down on the ground, the wind brushing his face like a familiar hand. He looked at the two crosses side by side and smiled faintly. You kept your promise, Clara, he whispered. You didn't leave. He sat there until the light grew warm, his eyes drifting toward the sky. The wind carried the faint sound of laughter, soft, childlike, distant. And for the first time in years, Elias felt no pain, no loneliness. When the townsfolk found him days later, he was sitting peacefully by the graves, his hands folded in his lap, his face calm. They buried him beside Clara and Daniel, under the same tree that had witnessed their story. As the years passed, the mountain became known as Widow's Rest. Travelers who passed by spoke of hearing voices in the wind, gentle laughter, a woman's song, a man's deep chuckle carried through the pines. No one ever disturbed the place. Wildflowers grew thick over the graves, and a small wooden carving of a bird sat at the base of the tree, wings spread wide, forever ready to fly. And when the wind moved through the valley, it carried with it a feeling, of love born from loss, of kindness found in the coldest night, of two souls who had learned, against all odds, that even in the harshest silence, there is room for grace.